Hello, I'm Claire. Once my life came to such a point that I had to have a relationship with a married guy just to make ends meet. But then he managed to put me through hell because he literally became obsessed with me. When I was 20 years old, I lost my mom. She died from an aneurysm. I was left with a 2-year-old son, and I had no other relatives, so it wouldn't be enough to say that I was tired. I was exhausted, both mentally and physically, working 2 jobs, trying to make the ends meet. I constantly remembered that my mom always used to say that I had to meet a nice man, otherwise my life was going to be unbearably lonely. And since I had no time to hang out somewhere to meet a guy like this, I registered myself on Tinder. My first match was with 40-year-old Jefferson, who immediately asked me out on a date. He didn't beat around the bush and told me right away that he was married and he was looking for a permanent girlfriend who he was ready to provide for financially. I didn't expect such an offer, and to be honest, I felt insulted that he thought I'd agree to that kind of relationship. I didn't want to be rude, so I thanked him for the evening and was about to leave when he gently, but strongly enough, took my hand and made me promise him that I'd think over his suggestion. All the way home, I was indignant, asking myself how it was possible to build any kind of relationship that way. But right when I entered my apartment, my eyes fell on a pile of the apartment bills. And in the morning, when I was dressing Johnny before taking him to daycare, I discovered that he was growing so fast that he no longer fit into most of his clothes. So, after a few days full of thinking, the promised financial stability outweighed all my moral principles, and I called Jefferson. He took me to a motel, and I felt extremely awkward and embarrassed. It seemed to me that everybody around knew why I was there. I can't say that I was disgusted to touch him, but at the same time, I had no butterflies in my stomach when he touched me. And after that, he gave me money for a taxi, but there was more than enough to get home. And that's how everything started. After a couple more of these dates, Jefferson decided to rent another apartment for me. It was way bigger than the old one, and there was a separate bedroom for Johnny. Later on, Jefferson not only took me to different cafes and restaurants, but he even started to stay overnight. We talked a lot, and he was very good with my son. And eventually, that made me start to think of us as a family. This lasted for a year or so, but then he came one day, and I noticed that he was unusually inspired, so to speak. He brought a bottle of expensive champagne, caviar, and something else, saying that he had great news and he wanted me to be the first one to know. That made me really excited. But he suddenly announced that his wife was finally pregnant and he was going to become a real dad. He just kept talking so happily. Well, I felt that something inside me had died. I tried to be supportive and hug him and tell him congratulations, but then almost immediately I rushed to the bathroom and turned on the water. It was supposed to deafen the sound of my sobbing. Of course I felt hurt, even though he wasn't really only my man from the very beginning. Everything seemed to be so unfair. When I got out of the bathroom, Jefferson told me that this was supposed to be our last meeting in a romantic sense. He was no longer going to give me money or anything, but he was willing to get me a job at his company's office, as he put it, so he could keep an eye on me. I knew that it'd be hard to look at him every day at work, but back then it seemed to be better than not looking at it at all, so I agreed. Of course, I was grateful for everything that he did for me and Johnny, but when he left, I cried really hard, cursing myself for falling in love with him. I couldn't help but think that if it was me who had gotten pregnant from him, that he'd never leave. Anyway, as they say, time heals all wounds, and very soon I stopped feeling miserable every morning when I went to work. I met a lot of nice people in his office, and it was nice to chat with them during lunch. There was even a guy who tried to hit on me. I mean, I wasn't really into him, but it's always nice to receive compliments and smiles on a daily basis. But once, when we were flirting in a hall, Jefferson passed by, and shortly afterward, the guy was transferred to our distant office. I didn't pay much attention to it, but after that, another coworker of mine who'd given me flowers and asked me on a date was fired for very uncertain reasons. All of this made me think that Jefferson had something to do with this, so I decided to talk to him directly. Jefferson was sitting at his desk, and he barely looked at me when I told him about those two strange coincidences. But then he suddenly turned his head and very distinctly said that he wouldn't allow me to be with someone else, just like that. The way he looked at me made me feel goosebumps on my back. I tried to object, saying I was no longer a part of his life, but he only waved his hand and told me to get back to work. He was really scary. And after I thought through everything, I understood that I wouldn't be happy having him in my life, even as an employer. So I quit my job. A few months later, when I was already working at another office, one guy from work asked me out on a date. His name was Tom, and he was really nice and kind, and he made me laugh all the time. So after a few more dates, I started thinking that this time I could really get married and have a real family. But that was until one evening when I returned home after we had another date and discovered Jefferson was there. My babysitter had let him in because my son recognized him as Mama's friend, and he had brought lots of stuff for Johnny. To be honest, that unexpected visit scared the living daylights out of me. Apparently, my babysitter felt something was amiss and was in no hurry to leave, while Jefferson, on the contrary, almost pushed her out of the apartment and locked the door. I felt so nervous that my hands got cold and I couldn't move, while Jefferson gently but firmly sent my son to his room. Then he went into the kitchen as if nothing had happened and poured himself a drink. He swallowed his glass in one gulp and suddenly said that he knew about my boyfriend Tom and was hoping that there was nothing serious between us. At that moment, I came out of my stupor. I rushed up to him, grabbed the glass from his hand, and confidently, if not to say with a challenge, I declared that we were going to get married. He grabbed me by the throat and squeezed with such a force that it seemed to me that for a second I might have even passed out. Then he released me, and while I gasped for breath, he was as furious as I'd ever seen him before. He left my apartment, shutting the entrance door really hard. I breathed a sigh of relief and began to wash the glass he had used, while tears flowed down my face. My hands were shaking. I swear I thought that he would hurt me or something. I wish I could say that was the last time Jefferson interfered with my life. But the next day, Tom called me from the hospital. He told me that he'd been beaten really badly right in the street by several unknown guys, and that a couple of his ribs and his leg were broken. He kept wondering why they didn't take any of his money or anything, while I was 99% sure about who did that to him and why. It was a warning from my ex. That scared me to death. I didn't want Tom to be hurt because of me, nor did I want something bad to happen to Johnny. I was afraid to go to the police because I didn't have any proof that Jefferson was to be blamed in all of this. Besides, after all the money he spent on me, I was sure that he had the necessary people everywhere. At the same time, I didn't want to spend my whole life in that fear. So basically, I only had one place to ask for help. That's why I took a taxi and went straight to his wife. I knew their address since I had worked in his office. This was the most humiliating talk I've ever had. And when I told her everything as it was deep inside, I was hoping that she would be understanding. But then she stood up from the couch where she was sitting and gave me a look full of pity and contempt. This made me stand up also, and right at that moment, she started yelling at me and grabbed me by the hair. She happened to be very strong and heavy, so much so that I couldn't stand on my feet, and we both fell on the floor. I don't know how long that fight lasted, but eventually, I managed to break free. I grabbed my purse. I rushed away from that freaking place without looking back, although I did hear her yell that if she ever saw me around her husband again, I'd regret it badly. I was so scared that I probably ran a couple of miles. Eventually, I was so out of breath that as I turned around the corner of some building, I sat right on the ground, cuddling my back against the wall, and I cried. I didn't see any other option for me and my son but to move away from that city and from those people as far as possible and just try to start my life over again. Of course, I had to explain everything to Tom, and not only to be fair to him, but also that somebody else would know about Jefferson, just in case. He freaked out at first, but then suddenly he told me that he had some distant relatives living on a farm, and that if I was okay with that, we could go and live there together, at least for a little while. I didn't have a clue where else to go, so I agreed. Now it's been 6 months already since we moved there. No sign of Jefferson so far, and that makes me feel relieved. Both Johnny and I love living here, far from the busy city, and Tom and I are going to get married in a few weeks. He really is my savior.